Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Calm in the Chaos. I'm your host, I'm a co host, Michelle Beatty. I'm a project manager and program manager, and I'm also a mental health advocate.
And I am your other co host, Valerie Dorsonville. I am a licensed mental health therapist. Thank you guys so much for joining us in Calm in the Chaos.
Yeah, we're excited. We are like over the first part of the year, right? Like it's,
Yeah, we
so
first half done.
it's in the books. It's been a year for so many people. And I just want to say take a moment and celebrate. You're still standing, you're still breathing, all the good things, and just believe goodness is chasing you down.
That's right.
And one thing, when Val and I were talking about the theme for this month, we were like, okay, one thing about mid year timelines, deadlines, all the things. There's the reminders, there's remember, they're on time, behind, however. So, how you felt it was great for us to talk about triggers that are associated with deadlines.
Yeah. I feel, especially to your point, once we hit mid year, there are often so many um, check-ins and deadlines and, deliverables that have to be done at this point in the year. And so one of those triggers can often be just the communication that may be coming in, changes to deliverables, unexpected changes to deadlines. I think that any one of those things can really send people for a loop, especially when you are preparing for something and then all of a sudden your expectation is not met. On either side, whether it was intentional or unintentional. So I definitely feel like those are some pretty common triggers that can really create a lot of tension when it comes to working within our teams as it relates to deadlines. Um, I don't know. What
So,
are your thoughts?
I think beyond like these woosah moments that you create when you're like managing deadlines, you're managing woosah moments, you're managing side eyes, like you're managing internal turmoil, sharp tones. And
Oh,
that could be, it doesn't necessarily have to be sharp tones, right? It could also be just these intense stares or yes, no, okay. It just shows up in different ways.
yeah. I I think in a lot of times we talk about when people give us a lot of communication and a lot of information, but there's also the flip side of that of not getting enough, right? And just getting one word answers when maybe the response needed to have a little bit more um, meat to the conversation. So I definitely can see how in these periods of heightened stress, how the communication does tend to shift and change in the midst of that period of time. Because everybody is not just managing just themselves, but also all of the different personalities and perspectives and needs of the people that you are interacting with. So, absolutely, absolutely. So,
I think, well, go ahead.
well, no, because I think my what I was gonna ask was in terms of the aspects of the places where we become somewhat triggered, right? Are there are there particular ways that you feel in the past that you've been able to kind of help maintain that tempo on the particular project despite maybe how communication and tensions are changing within the team?
Mm, communication is that, right? Communication is essential and timely communication. So for me, it comes down to making every effort to prevent delayed communication.
Okay.
prevent delayed communication, and then also when people are not getting what they want or what they need in order to progress, to keep the momentum to
Mhm.
meeting the deadline. And sometimes people get agitated when you ask for information that they've already submitted or already given me or the party or whomever, or if I'm asking on behalf of someone and they need it again, but they think it might be different the second time, like, well, I gave you what I had. It's no different. It was no different from,
Tuesday
this
to today.
morning. Yeah, this morning to this afternoon. Like, here we are. It's no different. But the person that I'm advocating for, asking for the information, they might be hoping for something different or
Mhm.
clarification. And so it's my responsibility to be the buffer, right? To be the buffer, to explain, thank people for their patience, explain the reason for the second or third ask, and what does that go with. And sometimes that's when you're definitely, to your point, navigating personalities, navigating temperaments, because you never know what kind of day that person's having. They could be at their max, they could be frustrated, they could be dealing with something else or multiple projects at one time. So it's just, you never know what's making that person frustrated. It's not necessarily something to take personal, but I do believe that it's something that you need to acknowledge. Don't let it be something like the elephant in the room, that cliche statement. Don't let it be the elephant in the room and you're just not acknowledging it. Acknowledge, call a thing a thing. Like, I know this might be an inconvenient ask, but I need to ask again because this particular stakeholder is looking for something different, or they want to know if there's an update because they want to make sure XYZ, whatever is associated with that. So I think delayed communication can really be a trigger, and that looks different in many ways.
I think the point that you bring up here, the clarification in terms of the way that you approach the communication is important. Like that additional piece of context can really help people mitigate and manage some of the maybe inaccurate stories that we tell ourselves as to why we are hearing or being asked this particular question or being requested to add additional information. It is not uncommon for people to often personalize requests. And so if you provide a little bit more context where it's not about the person that you are asking, but who you are presenting the information or the request for, I think that can really go a long way in helping to mitigate some of the worries or frustrations and abrasiveness that sometimes can happen when people do feel like they're being asked for updates from 6 hours ago that was already given and then having to give it again. So I think that added piece of communicating the context behind the communication is super helpful.
Oh, yeah. And I think that comes down to self awareness, being in tune to people, being the connector. I often say here on this podcast and even on our conversations offline, project managers, we're the temperament of the project.
Mm-hmm.
So we can simmer it, we can hype it up. It's like, what does that look like? I just think it's something that we're always mindful of, and even more mindful of as we mature and advance in our project management journey.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's key. Now, I got to ask you from a therapist standpoint, bring it in. Like, how does, from your lens, what's happening with our brains and bodies during deadline induced tension? I know you kind of touched upon it a little bit, but can you go a little deeper into what that looks like?
Sure. I think for when we are in periods of time of heightened tension, right? There's like a deadline that's coming. We're being asked multiple things, and oftentimes people can get a little bit overloaded with the amount of communication and maybe the amount of things that they're trying to complete in a particular period of time. And so when that occurs within our bodies, our brains can actually begin to interpret that as a threat. Now, most people, from an evolutionary standpoint, are versions of threat was like a mountain lion, right? Something that was going to actually eat you and cause you some physical harm. But because of evolution, that is not the only type of threat that our brain tags. It also tags threats to our identity, threats to our security, threats to our stability. And so when we are working within a team or we're working towards a particular deadline, and maybe the questions or asked or communications are starting to feel where people begin to personalize it and think, well, does this person think I'm incompetent? Does this person think that I'm not doing my job? Those kinds of thoughts ultimately reinforce the threat of an identity, right? Now I'm worried that people are going to perceive me differently or label me in a way that I don't think aligns with me. And what people naturally will do when you feel threatened is fight or flight, right? We go into that mode. And so what can then happen when we go into fight? Now, granted, most people aren't, boxing it out in the middle of their work parking lots, but how that can come across as aggression, right? That can come across in the communication. It can come across or flight, meaning avoidance. So now I see the messages, but here they go again, messaging me about X, Y, and Z. I'm just not going to answer it, right? And so how that begins to demonstrate itself in both fight as aggression, flight as avoidance, or in some people, it's a different response, which is more like overcompensating, where we begin to take on all the things in an attempt to make things smoother, quieter, and really try to mitigate conflict. So that person can sometimes end up taking on too many things in their attempt to keep the peace within the team. So there are lots of different ways in terms that people can their brains can kind of create this version and this storyline behind it that may be very very different than what's actually happening in real life.
It sounds like conflict resolution.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, yeah. But technically the conflict is with within yourself, not actually it may not actually be happening on the outside, right? Our perception is our reality. So if you perceive that a communication is, you know, attacking you, judging you, uh, it is our natural human response to become defensive. And how that defensiveness comes across is going to be different for everybody.
Micromanaging,
Absolutely.
silencing.
Avoid. I mean, I think avoidance is probably the easiest one, or people just shut down, right? I've had patients who will absolutely get into a point where there will be conflict within a dynamic, and they just go silent and begin to disengage and become quite detached, right? So there are lots of different ways that can absolutely show up. And each person's response is really different. And so it takes back to your original point of self-awareness. We have to know, how do we respond in these particular moments when stress does begin to rise? Am I the type of person who has a tendency to become more aggressive? Am I the type of person who becomes so overwhelmed that I begin to avoid things and push things off? Or am I the person who wants to do all the things just so that we can get to the finish line and hope that everything goes smoothly? And I think there's one other kind of response, um, which now completely eludes me. Fight or flight, faint. Oh, and freeze, which is we just get stuck. We just get stuck in the thought process that we can't think, sitting in a meeting and people are talking and it's like you didn't hear anything.
Yeah.
So there are lots of different ways that can come across. Passive aggressiveness is also a big one. People trying to, or what you may see is not necessarily passive aggression, but more they will say what they say, but under the guise of jest.
Mm.
And that can be a way where people can kind of get their point across but still fall back on this idea, well, I was just joking, right? When oftentimes people know the difference.
For sure. For sure. So let's get into a little bit about like what recalibration looks like. Can you go into some techniques that project managers, people working in tech can use in real time when they're feeling triggered at work, or managing trigger, like from like micro resets. I know that you sometimes have talked about here somatic grounding. You're a big breath work advocate. Any, along that line?
Um, I think the first thing to do is probably just communicate it, right? So let's say we are in a moment in an interaction and I'm starting to get a little bit elevated. One of the things I can do is say, can we take a step? Can we take a breath for a second? Like, let's take a step back. Because what's often happening in that moment is that while we are in this experience, our brain is also processing its own version of the experience. And so taking a moment to say, okay, can we review this again to make sure that I understand? So that way we are not responding to the version of the story in our minds, but the ones that's actually happening, right? Because our brains can create a whole novel out of like one sentence. So it's important to make sure that we can pause in the moment and kind of, and in that moment that you're asking for more clarity, just to review the information, that's also allowing you a few additional moments to continue to ground yourself, right? So one of the more from breathwork side is a physiological sigh, in which you take two short inhales and one long exhale. You can do it so discreetly that nobody will ever even notice that
I
you're doing
just did it.
it, right? Like, nobody would ever know, right? You can't tell that you took two inhales and one exhale. So it's a really like stealthy way to kind of get in a little bit more oxygen into your body, so that when you are done, it allows one, because our breathing tends to change the more elevated we become, so that those two inhales can really help to reoxygenate your brain cells, so that it helps to recalibrate you a little bit more. um, Another thing to definitely do is, if you can, take a full pause and just say, okay, I think we've worked to where we are right now. Can we circle back in like another 15 minutes? Let me process a little bit more of this information so that I can get back to you. It has to be a
Can we just stop right there? Let me tell you, I really think the power of the pause is like a superpower that
absolutely. It's
people in general need to really like. It's like a hug.
yeah.
And
It's
you control that.
You
Like
control it.
like pausing and saying not right now, which is a nice way of saying no, or not right now. Yeah, I can come back to that. We can come back to that. We have reached, we have reached a point where we just need to take a break and come back. I
Yeah,
think we need to use that more.
absolutely. And it's always funny when I mention that in a session. People, oh yeah, it never even dawns on people or even connects that it's okay to ask for it. It's okay to say, you know what? I think at this point, I think we've worked through quite a bit. How about we take let's take 15 minutes, kind of allow those thoughts and this, what we've done so far to really kind of simmer for a little bit, and then we can, and let's circle back. But the key is to, one, let's us, right? So that it's not a
Collective.
yeah, right. We have to make sure we use collective language, and then two, make it very time limited, right? You want to provide people with the most appropriate expectations as to when we're going to get back to this, right? Because if you're in the middle of engaging with someone who's maybe a lot more elevated and coming in a little bit more hot, if you just say, can we just do this later? That's going to derail the conversation, because they're very heightened and ready to get to a solution. But if you get
So
to,
hold on. So should they
uh-huh,
not say no? Like, so what does no look like? Because I feel like no is the answer. So meaning, let me explain. No, at this time, we need to take a pause. Like, everyone has shared their insight, their they made their contribution, and at this time, no more conversation. We need to reconvene. It could be in 10 minutes.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean it has to be until however, but so maybe no isn't the answer.
I
Maybe
mean,
it is.
it's, I think to your point, it's, yes, it's a no, but it's a no with a time frame. People need to be able to manage their expectations. So if we say yes, we're taking a pause, it can't just be we're taking a pause, period. It's we're taking
Mm-hmm.
a pause and let's reconvene in 10 minutes, in 15 minutes. Everybody, we've been working on this pretty diligently. How about everybody get up, go get some water, stretch, bio break, and then let's come back. That little period of time where we are able to kind of, again, ground ourselves and utilize that pause can really help to reduce some tension, provide some clarity, but also it provides people with the time frame in order for them to manage their expectations. So I think pause, but include a time frame. That helps people to really be able to manage themselves a little bit better. So now they're not, because what will happen is if you don't give the time frame, then people will begin to ruminate and just
For
keep playing
sure.
it over and thinking it over and again in their heads and what I was going to say, and then the next thing you know, now you have a whole movie because you're giving the version of what you were going to say, what you thought they were going to say, and then you come in maybe a little bit even more heightened than you started with, because our body doesn't know the difference between what's actually happening and the version of the storyline that you've created in your mind. It's going to respond to either one.
Yeah, but then that to me, in listening to you, my takeaway is the importance of active listening. You can't listen if you already have your answer ready to go.
Yeah. That, I mean, that's Stephen, uh what is that, Stephen
Covey.
Covey? Yeah, right, that you need to listen to understand, right, not listen to respond. And I think in those moments, being very intentional about how you communicate that is important.
For sure. Now, one thing that we always talk about here is a common theme. We try to like navigate and we come back to it, and that's burnout, right? We consistently bring awareness to burnout. So, Val, what is your takeaway that the listeners should think of when it comes to burnout, managing conflict of deadlines, or just conflict in general when it comes to managing deadlines?
I think the most important thing is that it's a two-way street. It is bi-directional. So when teams or people on the team are experiencing burnout, that's going to increase conflict. But it also works in reverse. So if people are experiencing a lot more conflict within their teams, that in and of itself can lead to can lead to burnout. If people feel like they're spending a lot of their mental and emotional energy in managing personalities, especially as a role, especially as a project manager, when you are oftentimes the spoke in the middle and everybody's having to come to you, you oftentimes are having to really field through a lot of communications, not just about what's happening with the deliverables, but also how are people responding to the dynamics within that space. And so as a project manager, you're often kind of holding a lot of that. And so it can really it's really one of those chicken or the egg kind of question, which came first, because it can really ultimately, no matter which way you start, it's ultimately still going to be create a problem.
Yeah, that's true.
So what do you feel like from through your lens that more professionals that you wish that more professionals knew when it came to, burnout and team conflict, or are there particularly any hard-earned wisdom that you've come to from your experience in how to kind of manage that tension within the teams?
For me, it comes down to just understanding the connectors, the why behind the deadlines,
Hmm.
the decisions that need to be made, understanding, being proactive and asking, can a deadline, is there any flexibility in any of the deadlines that we're working towards? Sometimes deadlines are set like a few days before they need to for whatever reason, maybe agreements ending or someone needs to report and they want to give the executive or a sponsor a chance to review it. And I just think transparency
Mm-hmm.
is really important. Transparency and the why behind the deadline and who needs to see. I think also from my experience, adding time for review, adding time for response, like not making everything a fire, like, oh, we need this. I mean, some things you're gonna need that day. Like that's just part of it, right? You're gonna need some same day urgencies, but I also feel like there's give people a chance to plan. Now, mind you, we know project management, things change every day. Every day is a new day. That's why some people just love it so much because every day you're coming into something different, right? It's like, well, I thought no cookie cutter over here. So stand ups and they can give you something different. A status can give you something different. So I just want to be sure to acknowledge that in this, but I definitely perceive transparency to be important and allowing time for a response. Knowing someone's on PTO,
Oh, that.
asking people, yeah, asking people, what do you have any PTO that I need to be aware of while you are during this? Who are your backups? Do they know? Are they aware of the project? Are they in the group chat just for visibility so they know what's going on? Like those are actually courtesies that are necessities.
Mm-hmm. I would absolutely agree with you there. Absolutely. I think we you know, come. It's going to sound strange coming from a therapist, but there are times where there are times when our feelings have to take a back seat to the logistics, right? The emotional intelligence part is being able to tell the difference. When are the times where I need to lean more into the emotion piece and allow that its proper space before we move into the logistics, as well as there are going to be absolute periods of time in the midst of really tight deadlines or things that need to be, deliverables that need to be done with a really quick turnaround, that we have to shift into logistics first, and then we can take this time afterwards to process from the emotional um, um, aspect of the interaction. So I really think that that piece of a certain level of emotional intelligence is definitely needed in that space to know where do we start and which one's okay, which one is best to start with first, and which one is it okay to put on the back burner, but ensuring that we do circle back to it.
And another thing, when timelines, deadlines, communications heighten, when there's triggers that are showing up, that are surfacing, that are bubbling to the top, that is an indication of feedback. So I think one thing that's really key is looking at it as not friction, acknowledging what it's bringing to you. It is bringing some form of tension. At the same time, it's not necessarily negative, right? It's letting you know, hey, this is something that we need to pay attention to. This is about to turn into a risk. This is already a risk and we missed it. Or, there's something else that's bubbling up and we weren't aware of. So stakeholder feedback that needed to be included before this deadline. I mean, there's so many different variations of like impacts, right? Components that could impact this. But one thing for sure, it is feedback. And one thing as project managers and program managers and people that work in tech, you got to keep a cool disposition, the duck waddling, the feet are going in the water, but you got to stay calm and cool and
Why?
say, okay, thank you for this feedback. I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm always thanking people for feedback. I'm like, thank you for that feedback. And then I have to go process it.
Fair, fair. I mean,
Yeah.
I definitely think the neutrality of the emotions is what's important, right? Emotions are data. There are points, there are pieces of information that we can utilize to really help guide how we manage and respond to things when they come up. And at the end of the day, conflict is not a bad thing. I know people get very uncomfortable with conflict, but Anywhere that there's a connection, there's going to be conflict. You don't even need to speak for conflict to occur. Two people could walk in pure silence, and just from their body language and visual cues alone can create tension. So it's important to recognize that the conflict in and of itself isn't a sign that something is wrong. It's a sign that something needs to be addressed. And that, I think, giving that a little bit of a quick reframe in which it's not a punitive thing, but something for us to be mindful of and pay attention to is really important.
It's hard not to take it personal.
Yeah, but you know, practice and more practice and more practice is important, because that is how we learn to navigate through these difficult, interactions. There's there's not there's not a person on this planet who hasn't dealt with some level of conflict, right? So it isn't the conflict in and of itself, it's the response to it.
Yeah, for sure. So remember to take a minute, breathe, ask questions, embrace being transparent,
Absolutely.
and educate. Why? The why behind the process, the why behind the ask. Is it needed? Those go hand in hand. Educating the why, communicating the why, and transparency go hand in hand, and that can be helpful. And self awareness, right? How we respond to things, how people respond to things, what to not take personal or attempt not to take personal.
Mhm. Try.
That whole thing. So thank you, Val. I think this was a good little mid-month check-in.
I agree. I agree. I think it's a great way to present ourselves as we are in quarter 3 of the year, which still sounds crazy to like moving into that. So I don't know. It's wild. I feel
Yeah.
like time's gone by so quickly.
Any parting thoughts? Any shares?
Um, I think most importantly, ask for what you need. There's nothing wrong with speaking up and saying, "Can we take a pause?" It is better to take that pause and allow yourself some space and some time to ground and really check in with yourself and check yourself, depending on what's going on in that moment. But at the end of the day, what we say can only be forgiven, they can't be forgotten, right? And so
Yeah.
it's important to be intentional about creating that space and that pause for ourselves in order to continue to maintain the connections that we have at work, as well as with our stakeholders. So that would be the parting thought that I would leave with everyone.
I second that.
Nice.
I second that. And I just want to encourage everyone, what we stand for is keep your stride, try not to take it personal. We've said that throughout this entire mid-month check-in. Transparent, breathe, try not to take it personal, communicate. And that self awareness is everything. Knowing when to ask for the pause, knowing when to speak up for yourself, advocate for your team. We didn't talk about that, but advocating for others when navigating a stressful, triggering timeline can also be a great way to build trust. And
Absolutely.
also, it gives visibility that you're out there for everyone. You're a team player, right? You're a team player and you're keeping everyone focused on what's important. So, and communicate your PTO. If you're on PTO,
Yeah, you wanted to tell people in advance, especially if you're responsible for upcoming things. You want people to know, hey, I will not be available, and here are the ways to kind of circumvent my absence and ways to still get what you need accomplished. Absolutely, that was a great gem. Totally agree.
no one is a mind reader. No one
Facts.
is a mind reader.
Facts. Nobody knows. So
So help everyone and
speak up.
communicate transparently. It's a thing. Anyway, we can keep talking. So we're just going to say we hope that the rest of your month is amazing.
Absolutely.
And cheers to the start of quarter 3. We wish you nothing but goodness. We're rooting for you. Remember to keep your stride and stay calm in the chaos. We wish you nothing but the best. Thanks for joining us.
Good night.